So I decided I wanted to try to move this project forward a little faster than just twice a week during the live streams. So today we're going to take what we learned from the socket fiasco and um, and enable the binding and the sockets inside of uh, the loopback and injector. So we can take a quick look. I made a small diagram of what the binding actually means. So we have a socket that is a member of the injector. This is an initiator socket. And similarly, we have a target socket that's a member of the loopback. And we need to bind the sockets on essentially either side of each of them. So for the initiator socket, we are binding it to the injector. And for the loopback socket, we're binding it to the loopback. And then we take the initiator socket and we bind it to the target socket. And that's with the bind call is pretty much only used when we inherit from the TLM backwards or forwards interface. So we're going to inherit from the TLM forward transport interface. One thing that we will need to do is generate a couple functions. Actually, I chose the wrong interface. I want to inherit from the backwards interface. And we will generate... actually, we only need to generate one because we've already generated NB transport forward. So we needed to add this invalidate direct memory pointer. And we should still be building. Okay. And so we're going to add a socket. And I noticed our formatting is off, so let's fix that. We're going to make it a public member for right now. So we're going to make an initiator socket, and we can just call it socket. And so we are going to first bind it to the instance that created this socket. So we're going to do socket.bind, and we're going to bind it to this, not Bing. But this should still not work because we need to dereference this. So let's dereference that pointer. And there's our binding that's done on the Axie injector. And then we will need to make a loopback inside our unit tests to bind as well. So let's go through and do that. One thing that I've added, I'm including gmock, and then we actually need to make sure that gmock shows up in the target link libraries. Otherwise, you'll run into a pretty weird error. And so we're going to create a mock loopback. And this is going to inherit from the forward interface. And actually before that, it also needs to inherit from SC module. Otherwise, we will get an error that says that we're creating a socket outside of an SC module. Okay, and then we will generate our functions. And we're just going to leave them as they are right now. We're going to create a socket. And this will be a target socket. We can also call it socket. And let's create a constructor, and we'll pass in a name so that we can pass that to the SC module constructor. And in here, we will take that socket and bind to a dereferenced this pointer. And so at this moment, the first socket we bound to the injector. This mock loopback socket we've bound to the loopback. And now we need to bind the initiator socket to the target socket. And the way we do that is in the beginning of the test, we have a setup function. This build test bench top gets called during the setup. And so we're going to take our injector dot socket and we're going to bind. And right now we can't bind to anything because we haven't created a loopback. So let's create one. We'll just call it loopback. And let's pass in a name. And there we have that. And let's grab a loopback dot socket. And there we have bound everything together. So our failing test was things weren't connecting, and now everything is connected. So this last step was connecting the initiator socket to the target socket. One thing that we'll notice here is there are all kinds of functions that got created. Well, all kinds. There are 4 functions here in the mock loopback, and there's one function in AXI injector that we will never use. These are for loosely timed models, and we are making an approximately timed model. And so I don't want them to exist because they're just code that we would need to maintain. So let's just get rid of them. But when we get rid of them, we no longer build because our AXI injector is now abstract. It has virtual functions inside the AXI injector, or inside the backwards interface abstract class that we are not overriding. So let's no longer inherit here, and we'll change this socket type to what I initially wanted. And we'll change it to a simple initiator socket. And this is a templated socket, and it takes in an AXI injector. So here we have our AXI injector simple initiator socket right there. And in the same way that we had to bind, so we can no longer call a bind call on the socket. So let's run. How does this get bound? Actually, before we do that, we should write a test that shows that things worked, that the sockets are working. Excellent. So let's copy this test. And let's test the MB transport forward. So we'll need to actually make this into a mock loopback. Right now, it's not really a mock anything. It's just a class that inherits. I mean, it is a mock, but we're going to use the nice utilities that gmock gives to us. And so we're going to make it a mock method. And it takes in the argument that we're going to return. It takes in the name of the function. It takes a list of the things that we're going to pass in. And I'm going to change this a little bit. So we don't need to pass in, we don't need to name everything. And instead of using the base classes for everything, let's grab the classes that we will be using. And we need to put a comma here. And that should be everything for mock method. So let's go ahead and build to make sure it's functioning. And we should still be passing. And then we have two tests that are exactly the same, but we're going to change this one. And we're going to expect a call on our loopback of NB transport forward. And we don't care about what the arguments are to that. So this is the Google way, or the Gtest way, to indicate that we don't care what we're receiving, but we do need to add a using clause at the beginning. So we're going to say using testing underscore. And now we're good here. And we're not going to test the return yet. We're just going to test that it gets called. And first, let's make it fail. So we expect it to get called. So on the socket, we're calling NB transport forward. Why are you failing? Well, this is saying socket is a pointer type, but I don't recall it being a pointer. That's a little funky. So this should look almost exactly the same. And so we failed. So let's get rid of this. We failed here. We expected this call to happen, but it didn't. And then when we called NB transport forward on the socket, now this works. One thing that... Okay, so this is functioning as we expect. So we're bound in the constructor here. We're bound in the constructor here. And we're bound in the build test bench function. So now let's change this to be the simple socket. So let's get rid of this type, TLM utils, simple initiator socket, and Axie injector. And we can get rid of this inheritance. And we're going to keep the NB transport backward function because we're going to use it. We do need to get rid of the invalidate direct memory pointer and the socket.bind, and I believe we should get a socket not bound error if we run at this moment. Which we don't. That's a little weird to me. However, I imagine if we call the loopback socket, if we call MB transport forward, or MB transport backward with the same payload, we can use the same payload phase and time. This should fail, I would imagine. Yeah, there we go. No transport callback registered. So the binding itself is actually just registering callbacks. And we never actually registered the callback. And so let's do that. And so we can do socket.register NB transport backward. And we're going to pass in this. And we need to pass in the address of AXI injector, NB transport backward. And I believe we should pass it now. Excellent. And if we wanted, we could put in a C out or something like that, just to make sure. And there we have it. Hello from MB transport backward. We have two calls because we call it here, and then we call it again here. We can get rid of that C out. We're not going to use that as any of our testing frameworks. So what we've done here is ensured that the loopback gets called when we call MB transport forward on the injector.socket, and then we ensure that the loopback.socket is calling NB transport backward inside the AXI injector. And the last thing we're going to do is get rid of all of these functions because I don't want them to exist and we need to maintain them. And we're going to do essentially the same thing that we just did with the injector. We're going to change this socket type to a TLM utils simple target socket. And instead of doing a socket.bind, we're going to do socket we need the template. Dot register MB transport forward. And actually, let's make sure that this fails. I believe this should fail. Excellent. And actually, this is no longer an override. So let's make sure that wasn't covering up a different issue. There we go, expected to be called, but wasn't called. So now let's register NB transport forward. And we're going to pass in this object and the address of mock loopback NB transport forward. And let's run it. So there we have our AXI injector and mock loopback connected using simple target sockets and simple initiator socket instead of inheriting from the NB transport interfaces, which are too much overhead. Those have multiple functions meant for loosely timed models when we're just running approximately timed. And I'm going to do this same exercise offline for the AXI loopback and have the same thing ready for us on Friday when we have another live stream. So you can check the GitHub repo for that. Thanks.